Susan, I'm gay.
The LGBTQ community has come a long way in how its members are portrayed in the mainstream media. It is now fairly common to see prominent LGBTQ characters and people portrayed in TV shows and movies. Additionally, there are many prominent openly LGBTQ cultural and political figures, which has broadened the exposure of the LGBTQ community to the masses in America. But in order to appreciate how far we've come, we have to take a look back on the history of queerness in mass media. In this video, I may use the terms LGBTQ, gay, and queer interchangeably, but I just want to go over the differences just so there's no confusion. Gay is a term that can be used in reference to all non-heterosexual identifying individuals, but is most commonly used in reference to cisgender homosexual men. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and sometimes they add plus to include other gender and sexual identities. While queer is an umbrella term that's used to distinguish non-heterosexual or cisgender individuals.
Morning, Eva. What are you doing up so early?
I couldn't sleep.
That means you're either happy or unhappy.
In the mid-20th century, Hollywood imposed the Hays Code, banning movies that showed things like sexual nudity, profanity, disrespect towards religion or laws, and sexual perversion. And homosexuality was included within sexual perversion. However, filmmakers could skirt around those bans through queer coding characters, giving them traits and qualities commonly associated with queer individuals. For homophobic audiences, filmmakers would queer code the villains, portraying male villains as flamboyant and feminine, and female villains with deep voices and domineering, manly qualities. This still happens today. Think characters like the Joker, James from Pokemon, and pretty much every classic Disney villain. Sometimes gay creators would lovingly queer code villains, such as Howard Ashman, who is the lyricist and helped create The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin, who queer coded pretty much all of those villains, but specifically Ursula, who he modeled after the legendary drag queen Divine. The 60s and 70s saw more visibility for the LGBTQ community in protests and civil rights movements. However, they were still rarely portrayed in media, especially in a positive light. In 1967, CBS released a special report documentary called The Homosexuals. In the textbook, they say, the goal of this documentary series was to delve into social issues that were too controversial for most other programs. During the production phase of this documentary, a prominent CBS correspondent referred to the project as the Pity a Poor Homosexual Show. Interview subjects were shown lying to analysts and had their faces hidden in the shadows, portraying a dark and sinister nature.
Today's demonstration is the latest of many staged by the militant group ACT UP, which has gained increasing influence on AIDS policy.
The AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s was a central issue for the gay community. It fueled bigotry amongst the public. The epidemic, however, forced Americans to face gay issues head-on because of the nearly 500,000 people who died in the US of AIDS between 1981 and 2001.
Okay, FYI, folks, most people that meet me do not know that I am gay.
Jack, blind and deaf people know you're gay.
The 1990s was the first time mainstream TV and movies featured prominent LGBTQ characters. Shows like Ellen, Will and Grace, and Queer as Folk showed the peaks and valleys of queer life, although these stories primarily centered around white cisgendered individuals. The 2000s saw the rise of reality TV, where real-life queer people were shown to audiences in shows like Survivor, The Real World, and notably Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. This media exposure to the masses helped shape public opinion on things like gay marriage, showing gay weddings and positive queer families.
I am privileged to pronounce you spouses for life. You may now kiss your husband.
The 2010s saw the mainstreaming of queer media and, in turn, positive queer public policy. This decade was the most transformative in the portrayal and acceptance of queer individuals and stories. 2011 was the first year that a plurality of Americans supported gay marriage, eventually being federally recognized in 2015, and having 61% of Americans supporting it by the end of the decade. According to a Gallup poll conducted in 2020, 16% of Gen Z Americans identify themselves as queer or transgender, while only 78% identify as heterosexual exclusively. Comparatively, only 5% of the US population identifies as queer or transgender. This has led to an explosion of queer representation in media primarily focused to young adult and teen audiences. Think shows like Generation, Elite, and Euphoria, which stars a transgender actress. Other shows starring queer characters have dominated mainstream TV in recent years. Shows like Schitt's Creek swept the Emmys last year, and RuPaul Charles became the most awarded Black person in Emmys history due to his work on RuPaul's Drag Race, a show made for and by the queer community, but has since found mainstream appeal. As TV branches off into more platforms like streaming and more niche types of TV channels, more and importantly authentic queer stories are able to be told. And as the masses become comfortable and accepting of queer stories and identities, these attitudes are ultimately reflected in our everyday life. In the last decade alone, the US has seen queer representation in our representatives, 2 senators, state governors, presidential cabinet members, a presidential candidate, NFL players and Olympians, among so many other groundbreaking individuals. Although there's still a very long way to go to achieve equal rights and root out discrimination towards the LGBTQ community, so many of these accomplishments would not have been possible without the media representation and portrayals we've seen of the queer community over the last 25 years.